Obese girl sold like cattle. Mountain man bought her and said, "Your body is so stunning." In a dusty frontier town, under the swing of the church bell and the jeers of a drunken crowd, a young woman is dragged onto the auction block, mocked, shamed, treated no better than livestock. Just when her fate seems sealed, a feared mountain man slams down gold, silencing the mob. But his words shock everyone. Her body is so stunning. The town whispers. Why would a ruthless loner defend her dignity? What secret strength does he see in her that no one else will admit? As winter storms close in and enemies circle, the bond between them grows until a ruthless rancher claims the girl as his property, threatening to take everything. The mountains will test their courage, the law will test their claim, and the truth hidden in old deeds may change the town forever. Will shame break her spirit, or will her strength and faith turn the jeers of men into a victory no one saw coming? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The flickering lantern light cast harsh shadows across the livery yard as townspeople huddled in the bitter Colorado evening, their breath frosted in the air, mixing with wood smoke from nearby chimneys. The crowd pressed closer, their boots crunching on frozen mud, as a scene of public shame unfolded before them. Jim Wheeler, town drunk and debtor, stumbled forward with his daughter Leilani. His fingers dug into her arm as he dragged her onto the wooden auction platform. The rough planks creaked beneath their feet. Leilani kept her head bowed, her long dark hair falling forward to shield her burning face. "Here she is, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice sharp in the winter air. Wheeler's girl offered to settle his debts to Mr. Harrison. He gestured to a stern-faced rancher standing at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed over his expensive coat. Cruel laughter rippled through the gathering. "Ain't worth half what her daddy owes," someone shouted. "Too fat to work," called another. The men's jeers grew bolder while the women turned away, clutching their shawls tighter. Leilani's shoulders hunched further with each barb. She'd endured their mockery all her life, but never had it cut so deep as now, with her very future being bargained away like a piece of livestock. Her father swayed beside her, reeking of cheap whiskey, as her worth was calculated against his gambling debts. "Starting bid is $50, the auctioneer announced, though his voice held little enthusiasm. "Who'll give me 50 for Jim Wheeler's girl?" Silence fell. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even the most heartless seemed unwilling to participate in such a transaction. Leilani's chest tightened. Was she truly worth so little that none would even bid? Then heavy bootfalls cut through the quiet. The crowd parted like water around a stone as Bennett Boone strode forward. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, despite his imposing size. His buckskin jacket bore the wear of countless seasons in the wilderness, and a long rifle was slung across his broad back. Whispers followed in his wake. Everyone knew of Bennett Boone, N-E-T-Y, the fearsome mountain man who rarely came to town, who spoke little and smiled less. Some said he'd been an army scout during the Indian Wars. Others claimed he was more savage than civilized. All agreed he was not a man to cross. Without ceremony, Bennett reached the platform. His scarred hand dropped a leather pouch that landed with a heavy thud. Gold coins spilled from its mouth, gleaming in the lantern light. "She's mine." His voice was deep as thunder, cutting through the shocked silence. He turned slowly, fixing the crowd with a hard stare. "And her body is so stunning, none of you men deserve even a glance at her." Leilani's head snapped up at his words, her eyes wide, with disbelief. Never had anyone spoken of her with such fierce appreciation. She found herself looking at Bennett Boone properly for the first time. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with old sorrows, but his eyes, when they met hers, held unexpected gentleness. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Women clutched at each other, scandalized by his bold declaration. Men shuffled their feet, unable to meet his challenging gaze. Even Harrison, the rancher, seemed taken aback by this turn of events. "Now see here, Boone," the auctioneer started, but Bennett cut him off with a gesture. "Count it," he growled, "more than enough to cover Wheeler's debts, with interest." His hand moved to rest on his knife hilt, not a threat, but a reminder of who and what he was. The auctioneer hastily counted the gold pieces, then nodded to Harrison. "The debt is settled in full, sir." "Then it's done." Bennett turned to Leilani, his voice softening slightly. "Come." Leilani hesitated only a moment before stepping away from her swaying father. Her heart pounded as she descended the platform steps. What kind of life awaited her with this fierce stranger? Yet anything seemed better than being sold to the highest bidder, or worse, finding no bidders at all. As she reached Bennett's side, he shrugged off his buckskin jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The leather was warm from his body, carrying the scent of pine smoke and open spaces. The gesture was protective, almost tender, making the crowd's whispers grow even more fevered. "Ain't right," someone muttered. "Man like that, taking a girl like her." Bennett's head turned sharply toward the voice. "Any man who sees only a body's size, and not the worth of the spirit within, is blind as a cavefish." His words rang with conviction. "I see what the rest of you were too foolish to notice. A woman of rare beauty and rarer strength." Leilani felt tears prick her eyes, even as warmth bloomed in her chest. All her life she'd been judged by her appearance, found wanting by cruel townsfolk who saw only her physical form. Yet this stranger had declared her beautiful, had claimed her with a fierce pride that silenced her tormentors. Jim Wheeler chose that moment to lurch forward, his face red with drink and anger. "You can't just take my daughter," he slurred. "She's my flesh and blood. You lost all right to her when you put her up for auction like cattle." Bennett replied coldly. "The debt is paid. She's free of you." He placed a gentle hand on Leilani's back, guiding her away from the platform. The crowd parted again to let them pass, their expressions a mix of shock, scandal, and something that might have been shame. Leilani kept her head high, though her cheeks still burned. Bennett's jacket was a shield around her, his presence beside her a bulwark against the stares and whispers. They walked in silence through the town's muddy streets. Lamplight spilled from windows, and somewhere a dog barked at their passing. When they reached the edge of town, where Bennett's horse was tethered, he turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said back there," he told her quietly. "About your beauty, about your worth. But I won't force you to come with me. The choice is yours now." Leilani studied him in the growing darkness. His face was stern but honest, his eyes holding no trace of mockery or cruel intent. She thought of the town behind them, of years of ridicule and her father's neglect. Then she thought of Bennett's fierce defense of her, the way he'd silenced her tormentors with truth spoken from the heart. "I choose to go with you," she said softly but firmly. "If you'll have me." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, softening his weathered features. "I reckon we'll do just fine together." He helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode into the gathering night, Leilani felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. Hope, and the first fragile seeds of joy. Behind them, the town's lights grew dim, and with them, the weight of old hurts began to fade. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of a new life where she might finally be valued for who she truly was. The winter wind nipped at her cheeks, but wrapped in Bennett's jacket, secure in his gentle strength, Leilani felt warmer than she had in years. Bennett's calloused hand closed gently around Leilani's smaller one, the warmth of his grip startling after the bitter cold of the auction platform. He guided her down the wooden steps with careful attention, as if she were something precious rather than the burden everyone had always claimed her to be. Her legs trembled beneath her, still weak from the ordeal. "Watch your step here," Bennett murmured, his deep voice pitched low for her ears alone. The boards were slick with frost, treacherous in the failing light. Behind them, the townsfolk's reactions rippled through the crowd like waves on a pond. Some laughed cruelly, making crude suggestions about Bennett's intentions. Others whispered behind raised hands, their eyes wide with scandal. A few women clucked their tongues in disapproval, while the men who had jeered earlier now shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding Bennett's stern gaze. Leilani kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her cheeks burning. She caught a glimpse of her father stumbling away toward the welcoming glow of the saloon, not even glancing back at the daughter he had just sold to clear his debts. The sight shouldn't have hurt. She'd long since grown used to his neglect, but somehow it still did. Bennett led her to where his animals waited at the edge of the livery yard. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood quietly beside a sure-footed mountain mule. Both animals were equipped with well-maintained tack and packed with the careful precision of an experienced frontiersman. "The mule's gentler," Bennett said, moving to help her mount. "Steadier in rough country, too." His huge hands encircled her waist, lifting her with surprising care onto the mule's broad back. The animal turned its head to regard her with one liquid brown eye, then went back to drowsing. From the shadows of nearby buildings, more whispers drifted. "Mark my words, that wild man means her no good," a woman's voice carried clearly. "Taking advantage of a desperate girl like that, shame on him. Probably want her for camp cooking and such." A man responded darkly. "Mountain men ain't known for their gentle ways." Leilani's shoulders hunched at their words. She had heard the stories about Bennett Boone, how he lived alone in the high country, coming to town only to trade furs and resupply. Some claimed he'd gone native during his Army Scout days, others that he'd lost his soul to the wilderness. Now she was completely at his mercy. Bennett ignored the gossip, checking the mule's girth strap before mounting his own horse. Without a word, he clicked his tongue and turned his mount toward the road leading out of town. The mule followed obediently, carrying Leilani away from the only life she'd ever known. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Their breath frosted in the cooling air as they rode, the only sounds the crunch of hooves in snow and the occasional jingle of tack. The town's scattered lanterns grew dimmer behind them with each step. After they'd ridden for perhaps 15 minutes, Bennett spoke again. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "No one's going to hurt you or shame you anymore." Leilani dared to glance at him then. The fading light caught the edge of his profile. The strong jaw shadowed with beard. The hawk-like nose that had been broken at least once. The network of old scars that spoke of hard living, but his mouth, usually set in such a grim line when she'd glimpsed him in town, was softer now. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, held no malice. They rode until full dark was approaching, the temperature dropping steadily. Bennett finally reined in beside a small grove of pine trees that would offer some shelter from the wind. "We'll make camp here," he announced, swinging down from his horse. He came to help Leilani dismount, his hands steady and respectful. Her legs were stiff from the ride, unused to being astride. She stumbled slightly when her feet touched the ground, and Bennett's hand shot out to steady her. "Easy there," he said. "Take a moment to find your legs." While she stood working, feeling back into her numbed limbs, Bennett efficiently set up their camp. He cleared snow from a patch of ground, laid out bedrolls on either side of the space, and gathered wood for a fire. His movements were practiced, speaking of countless nights spent in the wild. Soon a small fire crackled between the bedrolls, its warmth welcome against the deepening cold. Bennett unpacked some basic provisions, salt, pork, beans, coffee, and hardtack, setting them near the fire ring. Leilani hesitated only a moment before moving to organize the food. She might not know what her future held, but cooking was something she understood. Something she could do well, despite what the townsfolk had always said about her other failings. "I can prepare supper," she offered softly, "if you'd like." Bennett looked up from where he was caring for the animals, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "You don't have to," he said. "You must be tired." "I'd like to," she insisted. It helps me feel useful." He nodded slowly. "All right then. Thank you." Leilani set to work with the simple ingredients, settling into the familiar rhythm of cooking. She sliced the salt pork thin so it would cook faster, added beans to the small pot she found in Bennett's gear, and set coffee to boil. It wasn't much, but she took care with the preparation, measuring seasonings carefully and watching the fire's heat. The whole time she worked, she waited for criticism, for harsh words, about her clumsiness, or complaints about how long she was taking. But Bennett simply went about his own tasks, rubbing down the animals, arranging their gear, gathering more firewood. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable. When the meal was ready, she filled 2 tin plates and passed one to Bennett with trepidation. He took a bite of the salt pork, and his eyebrows rose. "This is good," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Real good. You've made something fine out of trail rations." The praise, simple as it was, warmed Leilani more than the fire. She ducked her head, unused to kind words about anything she did. "Thank you," she whispered. They ate in companionable quiet, the fire popping softly between them. Above, the sky had cleared, revealing a tapestry of cold stars. Leilani found herself stealing glances at Bennett as they finished their meal. His reputation painted him as dangerous, barely civilized. Yet he had shown her nothing but consideration since claiming her at the auction. When the plates were cleaned and stowed away, Bennett settled onto his bedroll, tipping his hat low over his eyes. Get some rest, he said. We've got a fair piece to travel tomorrow. Leilani huddled into her own blankets, but sleep felt far away. The events of the day whirled through her mind like wind-blown snow. This morning she had woken in her father's shabby house, dreading another day of townspeople's sideways glances and cruel remarks. Now she lay beneath the vast sky, in the company of a man who was practically a stranger. She clasped her hands together beneath the blanket and closed her eyes. The prayer came silently, uncertainly. Was Bennett Boone her rescuer, riding in at the last moment to save her from public humiliation? Or was he something darker, a captor who had simply claimed what he wanted, regardless of her feelings? Perhaps he was the answer to a desperate prayer she'd whispered long ago, on another cold night when hope had seemed far away. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on the snow. Across the glowing embers, Bennett's breathing had grown slow and steady. Leilani studied his sleeping form, trying to reconcile the fearsome stories she'd heard with the man who had defended her so fiercely, who had praised her cooking and treated her with unexpected gentleness. She still didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something besides shame and resignation, something that might have been hope, fragile as early spring flowers pushing through melting snow. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and rose. Frost had formed delicate patterns on their blankets during the night, crackling as Bennett and Leilani stirred from their sleep. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from their banked fire. Bennett moved with practiced efficiency, shaking out his blankets and adding wood to the coals. He glanced at Leilani, noting how she winced as she rose from her bedroll. "First time sleeping on the ground?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yes," she admitted, trying to stretch discreetly. Every muscle protested the night spent on the hard earth, but she was determined not to complain. "It takes some getting used to," Bennett said, pulling provisions from his saddlebags. "We've got a long ride ahead today. Best to eat something before we start." They shared a simple breakfast of hardtack and coffee. As they ate, Bennett explained their journey. "My cabin's up in the high country, about 8 hours' ride from here. We'll follow Thunder Creek most of the way, then cut through Miller's Pass." He paused, studying her face. "It's rough country, but the mule knows the trail. You just hold steady and let her do the work." Leilani nodded, trying to hide her apprehension. She had never traveled more than a few miles from town, and the Ikanas by, mountains looming ahead seemed impossibly vast. They broke camp efficiently, Bennett showing her how to roll the bedding tight and secure it to the pack saddle. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks when they set out, their mounts' hooves crunching through the frost-covered grass. The trail wound through stands of towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. Occasionally, they crossed small streams, their edges rimmed with ice. The mule picked its way carefully across the slick rocks, Leilani holding tight to the saddle horn. Her thighs and back ached from yesterday's ride, but she pressed her lips together and endured. They passed several abandoned mining shacks, their weathered boards gray against the white landscape. Through one broken window, Leilani glimpsed the remains of a rusty stove, a reminder of someone else's failed dreams. After they had ridden for several hours, Bennett broke the comfortable silence. "Need to know what skills you bring," he said matter-of-factly. "Can you shoot?" Leilani shook her head. "No, sir. Father never allowed me near his guns." "What about tending fire, working with wood?" "I can keep a fire going," she offered, "and I know how to cook and sew. Though father—" She hesitated, then continued softly. "He said those weren't worth much, called them women's trifles." Bennett's jaw tightened at her words. "Your father was wrong about a lot of things," he said firmly. "Good cooking and sewing are valuable skills up here. Difference between comfort and misery sometimes. Between survival and—" He left the thought unfinished. When the sun reached its peak, Bennett led them to a small clearing beside a half-frozen stream. "We'll rest the horses and eat," he announced, helping Leilani down from her mule. She bit back a groan as her stiff muscles protested. Bennett gathered wood while Leilani unpacked their provisions. She found bacon and cornmeal in the saddlebags, along with a small skillet and pot. Working quickly, she built up the fire and set water to boil for corn cakes. The bacon sizzled in the skillet while she mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt. She poured the batter carefully, creating perfectly round cakes that cooked to a golden brown. The familiar work helped ease her nervousness, and she found herself humming softly as she cooked. Bennett watched her work, noting her sure movements and careful attention to detail. When she handed him a plate of crispy bacon and steaming corn cakes, his eyebrows rose in appreciation. "This is fine cooking," he said after the first bite. "You've got a real knack for it." Leilani felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "Thank you," she murmured. "I like making things taste good, even with simple ingredients." They continued their journey after the meal, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, and their breath frosted in white clouds. Late afternoon found them winding through a narrow pass, the granite walls rising steep on either side. "Almost there," Bennett called back to her. "Cabins just beyond this ridge." As they emerged from the pass, Leilani caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The cabin sat nestled against a towering granite cliff, protected from the worst of the mountain winds. It was built of solid logs, with a stone chimney from which thin smoke curled into the darkening sky. A small barn stood nearby, and what looked like a storage shed. The sudden chorus of barking made her start. Half a dozen sled dogs bounded from behind the cabin, their excitement evident as they surrounded Bennett's horse. He spoke to them quietly, and they fell back, still wagging and yipping. "They're friendly," he assured Leilani as he helped her dismount. "Just excited to see someone new." Leilani's legs trembled as she stood, partly from the long ride and partly from nerves. Bennett led her to the cabin door while the dogs milled around them, sniffing curiously at her skirts. Inside, the cabin was dim but orderly. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace, and kerosene lamps hung from the beam overhead. Furs were piled on the single bed against one wall, and shelves held supplies and cooking implements. Leilani's eyes were drawn to a worn Bible sitting prominently on a shelf near the bed. Bennett moved to stoke the fire, adding logs until the flames cast a warm glow throughout the space. He turned to face her then, his expression serious. "Need to tell you something," he said, gesturing for her to sit in one of the rough-hewn chairs. "About why I bought you yesterday." Leilani perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been dreading this moment, wondering what he truly wanted from her. "I didn't buy you to be a servant," Bennett said firmly. "Or a slave. Or," he cleared his throat awkwardly, "anything else folks might have been thinking." He ran a hand through his graying hair, choosing his words carefully. "Truth is, I need a partner up here. Winter's coming hard, and there's too much work for one person to manage alone. Hunting, trapping, keeping the cabin warm, tending the dogs." He gestured at his left leg, and Leilani noticed for the first time a slight stiffness in his movement. "Got an old war wound that acts up something fierce in the cold, makes it hard to do everything needs doing." He met her eyes directly. "I saw how folks treated you in town. Saw your strength too, though you tried to hide it. Reckoned you might be willing to consider a partnership of sorts. Equal share in the work, equal share in what we make from the furs and such." Leilani sat very still, absorbing his words. Of all the things she had imagined, this had never occurred to her. "You want me as a partner?" she asked carefully. "Yes," Bennett nodded. "Won't lie, it's hard work up here. Cold and lonely sometimes. But there's freedom too. No one to mock you or tell you what you're worth. Just honest work and a chance to build something worthwhile." He paused, then added quietly, "If you're willing." Leilani stood in the middle of the cabin, taking in her new surroundings as Bennett moved about the space with purpose. The single room felt both cozy and overwhelming. This place that was meant to become her home. Flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and the heat from the stone fireplace slowly chased away the mountain chill that clung to her bones. "Let me show you where everything's kept," Bennett said, his deep voice gentle. He limped slightly as he moved toward a series of wooden shelves built into the far wall. "Got to keep things organized up here. Winter's long, and town's too far for regular supplies." Leilani followed him, noting how he favored his left leg. The shelves were meticulously arranged, each item in its place. Bennett pointed out the essentials: sacks of flour and dried beans, strips of jerky hanging from hooks, and thick glass bottles of lamp oil carefully stored away from the food. "There's sugar and coffee, too," he added, reaching up to tap a tin container. "Not much, but enough to last if we're careful. Root cellars outside. Got potatoes and other vegetables stored there." "You've prepared well," Leilani observed quietly, taking mental note of where everything was placed. Bennett nodded, then gestured to a trunk beneath the window. Medical supplies in there. Bandages, witch hazel, willow bark for pain. He paused, rubbing his thigh unconsciously. That old war wound. Some days it's worse than others. Makes it hard to do everything that needs doing. Leilani watched him, seeing past his stoic expression to the pain he tried to hide. Was it during your time as a scout? She asked hesitantly. Yeah. His answer was clipped, and she knew not to press further. Instead, she turned her attention to the kitchen area, taking stock of the iron pots and pans hanging from hooks, the wooden spoons and tin plates stacked neatly on a shelf. Would you like me to prepare something for supper? She offered. I saw vegetables in the root cellar, and with some of that dried meat, I could make a stew. Bennett's face softened. That'd be welcome. Been a while since I had proper cooking. Leilani set to work, glad to have something familiar to do. She gathered potatoes, carrots, and onions from the root cellar, their earthy scent reminding her of better times in her childhood. Before her mother passed, she found comfort in the routine of peeling and chopping, adding ingredients to the heavy iron pot that hung over the fire. As she worked, Bennett moved about the cabin, tending to various tasks. He checked the windows for drafts, added wood to the fire, and sorted through some furs piled in the corner. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft bubbling of the stew. When the meal was ready, Leilani ladled generous portions into 2 tin bowls. The rich aroma filled the cabin, and she felt a flutter of nervousness as she handed Bennett his portion. He took a spoonful, and his eyes widened slightly. This is real good, he said, the sincerity in his voice making her chest tight. Thank you, Leilani. She couldn't remember the last time someone had thanked her for anything. Her father had always taken her efforts for granted when he wasn't criticizing them. You're welcome, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. They ate in companionable silence, the wind outside growing stronger as evening settled in. Snow began to patter against the window panes, and the dogs could be heard howling in response to the gathering storm. After the meal, as Leilani washed the dishes in water she'd heated over the fire, Bennett approached her with an awkward clearing of his throat. About sleeping arrangements, he began. You'll take the bed. Leilani turned to protest, but he held up a hand. I've got a cot I can set up near the hearth. Ben, sleeping there most nights anyway, to tend the fire. But it's your bed, she argued weakly. I couldn't. You can and you will, he said firmly, but not unkindly. Ain't proper otherwise, and besides, you need proper rest after these past days. The howling of the wind grew louder, and snow pelted the windows with increasing fury. Bennett moved to check the fire one last time while Leilani finished with the dishes. He then retrieved a folded cot from behind some crates and set it up near the hearth, adding a thick bear fur for warmth. There's extra quilts in that chest, he told her, pointing to a cedar trunk at the foot of the bed. Night gets cold up here, even with the fire. Leilani changed into her nightdress behind a screen Bennett had thoughtfully set up in one corner. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, piled with furs and quilts that still held the scent of cedar. Yet sleep eluded her as she lay there, listening to the storm rage outside and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Her mind whirled with the events of the past 2 days. The shame of being auctioned like cattle still burned fresh in her memory. She could still hear the cruel taunts of the townspeople, their mocking laughter as her father had dragged her onto that platform. Too fat to work, someone had shouted. Only good for feeding the hogs, another had jeered. But then there was Bennett. His quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, the way he looked at her like she was a person of worth, not just a burden to be rid of. His genuine appreciation of her cooking, his insistence that she take the bed. These small gestures of respect meant more than he could know. Through the darkness, she could hear his steady breathing from the cot near the fire. He had positioned himself so that he was facing the door, she noticed, as if standing guard even in sleep. The thought brought unexpected comfort. The night passed slowly, snow continuing to fall outside. Leilani dozed fitfully, waking, often to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night. The moan of wind through the pines, the distant cry of a wolf, the creak of settling logs in the cabin walls. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the frosted windows, she heard Bennett stirring. She lay still, watching through half-closed eyes as he carefully added wood to the banked coals, bringing the fire back to life. His movements were stiff, and she could see him massage his bad leg as he worked. When she rose a short while later, Bennett was already dressed and had water heating for coffee. She moved to begin breakfast preparations, but he gestured for her to wait. "First things first," he said quietly, reaching for the Bible she had noticed on the shelf. "Hope you don't mind, but I make it a habit to start each day with prayer." Surprised and touched, Leilani watched as this rugged mountain man bowed his head over the worn book. His prayer was simple but heartfelt, thanking God for shelter from the storm, for the blessing of food, and, her heart skipped, for bringing them together in partnership. "Lord," he said softly, "help us to see your hand in all things, and to treat each other with the respect you show to all your children. Amen." Leilani wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Amen," she whispered, understanding now that this strange twist of fate, being sold at auction to a mountain man, might truly be an answer to prayer after all. The morning light grew stronger, revealing a world transformed by snow. As Leilani moved to prepare their breakfast, she felt something settle in her heart. Not quite peace, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of hope. Bennett's quiet respect had shown her a glimpse of what partnership, not ownership, could mean. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she felt stronger knowing she would not walk it alone. The mountain days settled into a steady rhythm as January deepened. Each morning, Bennett and Leilani rose, before dawn, sharing quiet prayers before starting their work. The cabin, once merely shelter, began to feel more like a home with each passing day. Bennett proved to be a patient teacher. One crisp morning, he spread his collection of steel traps on the wooden table, their mechanisms gleaming in the early light. "These here are beaver traps," he explained, his weathered hands demonstrating how to set the springs. "Got to be careful with them, they don't care what they catch." Leilani watched intently, her eyes following his movements. The traps were heavy in her hands, but she was determined to learn. Bennett showed her how to test the mechanism safely, using a stick instead of fingers. "That's right," he nodded approvingly when she successfully set one. "You've got steady hands." His praise, simple as it was, warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. It was so different from her father's constant criticism, from the townspeople's mockery. Later that week, Bennett brought out worn leather harnesses that needed mending. The dogs lay nearby, watching with interest as he explained where the straps had torn. "Winter's hard on the gear," he said, showing her how to punch new holes in the tough leather. "But good stitching makes it last." Leilani's fingers were already familiar with needle and thread. She worked carefully, her stitches neat and strong. The leather was stubborn, but she persisted, remembering her mother's lessons about patience in sewing. When she finished the first repair, Bennett examined her work with careful eyes. "Better than I could do," he admitted, running a thumb over the even stitches. "You've got a gift for this kind of work." She ducked her head at the compliment, but pleasure bloomed in her chest. Her father had always dismissed her sewing as women's foolishness, but here was Bennett, treating her skill with respect. The days fell into a comfortable pattern. While Bennett checked his trap lines or chopped wood, Leilani kept the cabin in order. She took pride in preparing hearty meals from their stored provisions: bean soups, thick with dried vegetables, cornbread sweetened with the last of the molasses, stews that simmered all day on the wood stove. One afternoon, she discovered some scraps of soft-tanned deerskin left from Bennett's hunting. An idea formed in her mind. While he was out with the dogs, she measured and cut the leather carefully, then stitched it into warm moccasins. Her mother had taught her the technique years ago, though they'd only used cloth back then. When Bennett returned, snow dusting his shoulders, she presented the moccasins shyly. "I noticed your old ones were wearing thin," she explained, afraid he might think she had overstepped. Bennett held the moccasins with careful hands, examining the neat stitching and practical design. "These are fine work," he said softly. "Real fine work." He sat down to try them on, and a smile creased his weathered face. Fit perfect, too. Yet, despite these moments of progress, Leilani's old wounds ran deep. She avoided the small mirror hanging by the wash basin, knowing what she would see: the heavy-set figure that had drawn so much scorn in town. Sometimes she caught herself wondering when Bennett would tire of her presence, when he would realize what everyone else seemed to know, that she was too fat, too plain, too much of everything wrong. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon when she was baking bread. Lost in her worried thoughts, she forgot to check the oven in time. The smell of burning filled the cabin, and when she pulled out the loaf, it was blackened on the bottom. Tears welled up immediately. Memories of her father's angry voice ringing in her ears. "Useless girl," he would have shouted. "Can't even bake bread right." The familiar shame crashed over her, and she sank down at the table, trying to stifle her sobs. That was how Bennett found her when he came in from checking the trap lines. He took in the scene, the burnt bread, her tears, and crossed the room in his quiet way. Without a word, he pulled up a chair beside her and gently took her trembling hands in his calloused ones. "We'll eat it anyway," he said simply. "What matters is you tried." Leilani looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, hardly daring to believe his response. There was no mockery in his face, no disgust or anger, just steady acceptance. "But I ruined it," she whispered. Bennett shook his head. "Ain't ruined. Just got a bit too done on one side. We'll cut that part off and feed it to the dogs. Rest will taste just fine with some butter." His matter-of-fact tone, the way he made it seem so simple, reached a part of her heart that had been walled off for years. Fresh tears came, but these were different tears of relief, of gratitude for this man who saw past her mistakes to her worth underneath. That evening, as the lamp burned low and snow fell softly outside, Bennett took down his mother's old hymnal from the shelf. The book was worn, its pages yellow with age, but he handled it with reverence. "Used to sing these with my ma," he said, a touch of memory softening his voice. "Been a while since I tried, though." He opened to a familiar hymn, one Leilani remembered from her own childhood church days. Their voices rose uncertainly at first, his deep and rough, hers quiet and hesitant. The words were slightly out of tune, the timing not quite right, but something beautiful happened in that imperfect singing. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. They sang together, the old words filling the cabin with their simple truth. Bennett's voice cracked on some notes, and Leilani sometimes came in too late, but neither seemed to mind the mistakes. As they sang, Leilani felt something shift inside her, like a frozen stream beginning to thaw. This cabin, this man, this simple life of shared work and quiet respect. It felt like something she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just shelter from the cold, but a place where she could be herself, mistakes and all, and still be valued. The hymn ended, its last notes fading into the comfortable silence of the cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and Leilani realized she felt truly at peace for the first time in years. She looked at Bennett, who was carefully closing the hymnal, and saw not the fearsome mountain man of town gossip, but someone who had also known loneliness, who understood the value of simple kindness. Perhaps that was why he had seen past her size, past the town's cruel judgment, to the person she could be. The feeling of belonging grew stronger, taking root in her heart like a seed finding good soil. It was too early to name it love, too soon to be certain of anything except this. Here, in this cabin, with this quiet man, she was beginning to find herself again. The evening had settled into its usual quiet rhythm. Bennett sat near the hearth cleaning his rifle, while Leilani darned a pair of wool socks by lamplight. The dogs dozed near the door, their occasional snores mixing with the crack and pop of burning logs. Outside, snow fell steadily, adding another layer to the deep drifts that surrounded the cabin. A sharp knock at the door shattered their peace. The dogs jerked awake, hackles rising as they let out low growls. Bennett set aside his rifle and motioned for Leilani to stay seated. His movements were cautious as he approached the door, one hand resting near the pistol at his hip. "Who's there?" Bennett called, his voice hard with suspicion. "Marshal Dillard," came the reply, muffled by the thick door. "Need a word with you, Bennett." Leilani's hands trembled as she set aside her mending. The marshal's presence could mean nothing good. Bennett glanced at her, his expression grim, before unbolting the door. Marshal Frank Dillard stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air and swirling snow. Ice crystals clung to his mustache and badge, and his heavy coat was dusted white. He removed his hat, revealing lines of worry creasing his weathered face. "Evening, Bennett. Miss Leilani." The marshal nodded to each of them. "Sorry to disturb you at this hour, but this couldn't wait." Bennett gestured to a chair, but his stance remained wary. "What brings you up the mountain in this weather, Frank?" The marshal settled heavily into the offered seat, rubbing his cold hands together. "Wish it was just a social call." He looked between them, his expression grave. "Got some troubling news from town. Caleb Matthews, the rancher who held your father's debts. Miss Leilani, he's making claims about the auction." Leilani's heart clenched. She had hoped never to hear that name again. Matthews had been ruthless in pursuing what her father owed, threatening and humiliating them at every turn. "What claims?" Bennett's voice was dangerously quiet. "He says the auction wasn't legal." The marshal pulled out a folded document from inside his coat. "According to Matthews, Leilani was listed as collateral on some of those debts. He's arguing that means she couldn't be sold separate from the debt itself. That's horse manure, and you know it, Frank." Bennett's hands clenched into fists. "I paid fair and square. Everyone in town witnessed it. I ain't saying I agree with him." The marshal held up his hands. "But Matthews has friends in high places, and he's got papers with signatures on them. Unless you can prove otherwise, the law might have to side with him." Leilani felt the room spin. Her throat closed up as memories of Matthews' cruel smiles and threatening gestures flooded back. He can't take me back," she whispered. "Please." "No one's taking you anywhere," Bennett growled. He moved to stand between her and the marshal, his broad shoulders tense. "I don't care what kind of papers he's got. That auction was witnessed by half the town. I paid good money, and Leilani's not property to be passed around." The marshal sighed, looking truly regretful. "I understand how you feel, Bennett, but unless we can prove those debt papers are false, or find some other legal standing, Matthews has a claim the court might uphold." He stood slowly, settling his hat back on his head. "I came to warn you, give you time to prepare. Matthews is talking about riding up here himself once the weather clears. Let him come." Bennett's voice was cold as the storm outside. "He'll find more than he bargained for. Don't do anything rash," the marshal warned. "That's exactly what he wants, an excuse to bring the law down on you. Give me time to look into these papers. Maybe we can find something that proves they're not what they seem." Leilani watched the exchange through tears she couldn't hold back. Everything she had begun to build here, the peace, the sense of worth, the fragile hope seemed to be crumbling around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Bennett turned to her immediately, his expression softening. "This ain't your doing. Matthews is the snake here, not you." The marshal moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I'll do what I can to buy you time. But be careful, both of you. Matthews isn't known for playing fair." He pulled his collar up against the cold. "I'll send word if I learn anything useful." After the marshal left, silence fell heavy in the cabin. The dogs settled back down, but their ears remained alert, as if sensing the tension in the air. Outside, a wolf's lonely howl echoed through the darkness, answered by others in the distance. Leilani stared at her hands, twisted together in her lap. Perhaps I should go back," she said quietly, "before Matthews causes more trouble. You've already done so much for me, and I can't bear to think of you suffering because of my father's debts." "No." Bennett's voice was firm as he knelt before her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Leilani. What happened at that auction wasn't just a business deal. It was me choosing to stand against the kind of cruelty Matthews deals in. I won't let him drag you back to that life. But what can we do?" Her voice broke. "He has money, influence, papers with signatures. All we have truth on our side." Bennett cut in. "And more importantly, we have something Matthews will never understand." He squeezed her hands gently. "Your worth isn't measured in coins or papers. It's in your heart, your spirit, the way you face each day with grace, despite what people like him have done." Tears spilled down Leilani's cheeks. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just of going back, but of what he might do to you. Men like Matthews don't stop until they destroy everything in their path." Bennett reached up and gently wiped away her tears with a calloused thumb. "Then he's in for a surprise. Because I've faced worse than him in my time, and I won't let him hurt you. We'll fight this proper, through the law if we can. But if he thinks he can just ride up here and take you away, he's badly mistaken." Another wolf's cry pierced the night, closer this time. The sound carried a warning, like nature itself acknowledging the dangers gathering around them. The dogs stirred uneasily, moving closer to where Bennett and Leilani Saturday. "What will we do?" Leilani asked softly. "First thing tomorrow, I'm going through every paper I've got from that auction. The marshal's right there might be something we can use." Bennett stood, moving to stoke the fire. "And I know some people in town who owed favors to my father. Time to call them in, see what they know about Matthew's dealings." Leilani watched him, struck by the quiet strength in his movements. This man, who had already given her so much, was willing to fight for her against impossible odds, not because she was property to be defended, but because he saw her as someone worth protecting. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Bennett turned from the fire, his face shadowed but his eyes intense. "Don't thank me yet. We've got hard days ahead, and Matthews won't give up easy." He paused, seemed to struggle with his next words. "But I want you to know something, Leilani. Whatever happens, whatever he tries, you have a home here. Not because I bought you, but because you've earned your place with your own 2 hands." The wolves called again, their voices a wild chorus in the darkness. But inside the cabin, despite the fears pressing in from all sides, Leilani felt a spark of courage take hold. Bennett was right, Matthews might have money and influence, but he didn't have the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to see them through. Bennett moved to check the door's heavy bolt, then added another log to the fire. The flames leaped higher, pushing back the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they were safe in this small fortress they had built together. The dogs settled once more, though their ears remained pricked toward the door. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the wolves sang their ancient songs to the hidden moon. Inside, Bennett and Leilani sat in companionable silence, each lost in thought but drawing strength from the other's presence, preparing in their own ways for the storm they knew was coming. Dawn broke cold and gray over the mountain cabin. Bennett checked the horses while Leilani packed supplies for their journey into town. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped bread and cheese in clean cloth, remembering the cruel faces from the auction block. But things were different now. She had Bennett beside her. "Weather's turning nasty," Bennett said as he came back inside, stomping snow from his boots. "Trail's icy, but we can't put this off. You ready?" Leilani nodded, pulling on the warm coat Bennett had given her. It was made for a man, but she'd altered it to fit, adding extra padding where needed. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice wavered. They set out as the sun climbed higher, though its weak light barely penetrated the heavy clouds. Their breath frosted in the air, and the horses' hooves crunched through crusted snow. Bennett led them carefully along narrow mountain paths, where one misstep could mean disaster. "Trail's treacherous this time of year," Bennett explained, guiding his horse around a particularly icy patch. "Most folks wouldn't risk it, but we need answers more than safety right now." Leilani gripped her reins tighter, trying to mirror Bennett's steady posture. The mule beneath her was sure-footed, but the descent made her stomach clench. They passed the morning in careful progress, stopping occasionally to rest the animals and share sips of hot coffee from Bennett's battered tin flask. By early afternoon, the settlement came into view, a collection of wooden buildings huddled against the winter landscape. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of hammering carried from the blacksmith's forge. Leilani's chest tightened as they approached. This was the first time she'd returned since that horrible night. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Whispers followed them like shadows. Leilani heard the words that had haunted her for years: fat, useless, burden. But now they were paired with new ones: Mountain Man's woman and Boone's charity case. Bennett rode closer to her side, his presence like a shield. "Hold your head high," he murmured. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." They dismounted outside the mercantile, where Bennett needed to purchase supplies. Inside, the store fell quiet as they entered. The shopkeeper's wife stared openly at Leilani, then bent to whisper behind her hand to another customer. Bennett's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level as he requested nails, coffee, and other necessities. Leilani felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. She focused on examining a shelf of dried goods, trying to make herself smaller, an impossible task for someone of her size. A group of young women near the fabric counter giggled, their eyes cutting in her direction. Bennett's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "See anything we need for the cabin?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the store. "Your cooking's been so good. I reckon we should stock up proper." The simple praise, delivered so publicly, straightened Leilani's spine. She managed a small smile and pointed to some dried herbs she knew would improve their meals. The giggling women fell silent, watching as Bennett treated her with obvious respect. From the mercantile, they made their way to the church, a humble building with a crooked cross atop its steeple. Preacher Mills met them at the door, his kind face creased with concern as they explained their situation. "Debt papers or no," the preacher said, settling behind his desk. "A person's freedom isn't something that can be bought and sold like cattle. The Lord made each of us in his image, and no amount of money can change that truth." "Matthews seems to think different," Bennett replied grimly. The preacher nodded, running a hand through his gray hair. "I remember when Leilani's father first started borrowing from Matthews. Bad business that was. But what happened at that auction?" He shook his head. "It wasn't right, and plenty of folks knew it, even if they didn't speak up." "Would you be willing to say that before a judge?" Bennett asked. "If it comes to that? Course I would." The preacher looked directly at Leilani. "Child, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You deserve better than what life's handed you so far. If my testimony can help set things right, you've got it." Tears pricked at Leilani's eyes. "Thank you, Preacher Mills." Their next stop was the blacksmith shop, where the heat of the forge offered welcome relief from the cold. Bennett discussed tools and horseshoes while Leilani waited near the door, watching sparks fly up into the smoky air. Two ranch hands entered, stamping their boots. One nudged the other when he spotted Leilani. "Hey there, pretty thing," he called out with obvious mockery. "Mountain man feeding you good?" "Sure looks like it." Before Leilani could shrink away, Bennett was there. He didn't speak, didn't move, just fixed them with a stare so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the already chilly shop. The ranch hand's smirks faded. They backed away, muttering excuses, and hurried out the door. The blacksmith watched them go, then spat into his cooling bucket. "Good riddance," he growled. "Don't mind them, miss. They work for Matthews, got no more manners than their boss." As afternoon faded toward evening, Preacher Mills insisted they stay the night rather than risk the mountain trail in darkness. "Martha's got the spare room ready," he said, referring to his wife. "It's simple, but warm." That night, in the preacher's back room, Leilani sat on the edge of the narrow bed, unable to sleep. Bennett had taken a pallet on the floor, his breathing steady in the darkness. The day's events tumbled through her mind, the stares, the whispers, the mockery. But something was different now. The shame didn't cut quite so deep. "Bennett?" she whispered. Thank you. For today. For..." She struggled to find the words. "For not being ashamed to be seen with me." The darkness shifted as Bennett sat up. "Leilani, listen close. Those folks out there. With their mean words and meaner hearts, they're the ones who ought to be ashamed. Not you. Never you." His voice was rough with conviction, and Leilani felt something warm unfurl in her chest. The whispers would still hurt tomorrow, the stares would still cut, but she was no longer facing them alone. Bennett's steady presence had shown her that she was worth defending, worth protecting, worth so much more than she'd been led to believe. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft and steady in the lamplight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this quiet room, Leilani felt something she hadn't known in years. Peace. Not because the world had suddenly grown kinder, but because she had found someone willing to stand beside her against its cruelty. "Try to rest," Bennett murmured. "We've got a long ride home tomorrow." Home. The word settled in Leilani's heart like a prayer. Whatever Matthews might claim, whatever papers he might hold, she knew where she belonged now. In a cabin high in the mountains, where worth wasn't measured by appearance or other people's judgment, but by the strength of one's character and the truth in one's heart. The mountain air bit sharp and clean as Bennett and Leilani returned from town. Their cabin welcomed them with smoke curling from the chimney they'd banked the fire well before leaving, and the sled dogs erupted in joyful barks at their approach. "Home sweet home," Bennett said, helping Leilani down from her mule. His movements were stiffer than usual, and she noticed him favoring his left side. Inside, they quickly fell back into their routine. Leilani stoked the fire and started a pot of beans while Bennett tended to the animals. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, his face was drawn with pain. Your wound's troubling you, Leilani observed, stirring the beans. Bennett nodded, easing himself onto a chair. Old injury acts up in the cold. Army surgeon said I was lucky to keep the arm. We need more firewood, Leilani noted, glancing at their dwindling pile. I can see to that while the beans cook. No need. I'll manage. Bennett pushed himself up with a grunt, but Leilani saw him wince. Let me help, she insisted. You've done enough for today. Outside, the woodpile needed replenishing. Bennett gripped the axe, but his first swing was awkward, the blade glancing off the log. He tried again, jaw clenched against obvious pain. Leilani stepped forward. Please, let me try. Bennett looked ready to refuse, but another twinge seemed to change his mind. He handed her the axe, watching with concern. Mind your footing. Ice under that snow. Leilani positioned a log on the chopping block. The axe felt heavy but familiar. She'd split wood before, though her father never acknowledged the work. She took a deep breath, raised the axe high, and brought it down. The log split clean through with a satisfying crack. Bennett's eyebrows rose. Leilani set up another log, split it just as cleanly. Her arms were strong from years of hard work, her larger frame giving her natural power. Soon, she had a rhythm going. Lift, swing, split, stack. A laugh broke through the winter air. Bennett was watching her with open admiration. Well, I'll be damned, begging your pardon. You're stronger than most men I've seen, Leilani. Where'd you learn to swing an axe like that? She paused, cheeks flushed from effort and praise. Someone had to keep the woodbox filled. Father was usually. She didn't finish, but Bennett nodded in understanding. Reckon he never saw what was right in front of him, Bennett said quietly. A daughter worth more than gold. Leilani's hands trembled on the axe handle, but not from fatigue. No one had ever spoken of her with such respect. They worked together, Leilani splitting while Bennett stacked, until the woodpile was fully replenished. Inside, the beans had cooked to perfection. Over supper, Bennett spoke more about his past than he had before. 15 years as an Army scout, he said, breaking cornbread into his bowl. Saw things no man should see. Both sides did terrible things in those wars. Started to eat at my soul, all that killing. Is that when you were wounded? Leilani asked softly. Bennett nodded. Comanche arrow, if you can believe it. Went clean through but got infected. Fever nearly took me. When I recovered, I knew I was done with war. Came up here to find peace. He looked around the cabin, found solitude instead. Until now. Leilani stirred her beans. I was alone too. Even with father there, I was alone. The other girls in town. She swallowed hard. They were cruel. Called me names. Said no man would ever want me. Cruel people speak from their own emptiness, Bennett said. Besides, they were wrong. Their eyes met across the table, and something warm and uncertain flickered between them. Before either could speak, wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Storm's coming, Bennett observed, grateful for the distraction. He limped to the door and opened it to check the sky. Heavy snow. Might be trapped inside a day or two. They cleaned up from supper and settled in for the evening. The wind grew fiercer, driving snow against the cabin walls. Bennett brought out his toolkit, showing Leilani how to repair broken harness straps and oil rusty implements. Steady hands, he commented as she stitched leather with precise movements. You've got a gift for detail work. Mother taught me to sew before she passed, Leilani said. Said a woman's hands could speak love through simple things, mended clothes, warm meals, gentle touch. She paused, remembering. Father said I was wasting time with woman's work. Your father was a fool, Bennett said flatly. These skills keep body and soul together up here, more valuable than gold. As they worked, Bennett began humming a hymn. Amazing Grace. Leilani knew it from church and joined in softly. Their voices blended in the lamplight, rough but sincere. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. Bennett's baritone complemented Leilani's alto, filling the cabin with simple harmony. When they finished, Leilani realized she was smiling, really smiling, without hiding behind her hand as she usually did. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, surprising them both. It was a clear, joyful sound that seemed to brighten the cabin. Bennett stared at her, then smiled himself. That's a sound worth hearing, he said softly. Leilani touched her lips, amazed at her own boldness. I can't remember the last time I laughed like that. Then it's long overdue. They worked late into the evening, mending and talking. Bennett shared stories of the mountains tracking elk through deep snow, finding lost travelers, nursing injured wolves back to health. Leilani spoke of her mother's gardens, of learning to cook by scent and touch, of dreams she'd kept hidden in her heart. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin was warm with more than just firelight. Leilani felt the hard shell of shame that had enclosed her for so long beginning to crack. Here, with this quiet man who saw her strength and valued her skills, she didn't need to make herself small or invisible. Bennett watched her work, noting how her fingers moved with confidence now, how she held herself straighter. The fearful woman from the auction block was transforming, revealing the capable, caring person who had been hidden beneath years of cruelty. Getting late, he said finally, when the tools were mended and put away. Storm's not letting up. No, Leilani agreed, listening to the wind. But I don't mind being trapped here. She blushed at her own words. I know what you mean, Bennett said gently. This cabin's been just walls and a roof for too long. Having you here. He cleared his throat. Well, it's starting to feel like a home. Leilani's heart swelled with emotions she couldn't name. As she prepared for bed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror Bennett used for shaving. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately look away. The face that looked back at her seemed different, somehow stronger, more alive. The storm howled through the night, but Leilani slept soundly, wrapped in quilts and the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Her last thought, before drifting off, was of Bennett's words, stronger than most men. Not mocking, but admiring. Not dismissing, but seeing. Truly seeing who she was and what she could do. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, in this snug cabin high in the Colorado mountains, Leilani felt her shame continuing to melt away like snow in sunshine, replaced by something warmer and far more precious, joy. The mountain air grew softer as March yielded to April. Snow still capped the highest peaks, but lower slopes revealed patches of earth where determined wildflowers pushed through melting drifts. Near the cabin, tiny purple and yellow blooms dotted the awakening grass, their delicate faces turning toward the strengthening Sunday. Leilani stood in the doorway, breathing deeply of the changed air. The morning held a different scent, now wet earth and new growth instead of winter's sharp crystal clarity. Water music filled the valley as countless streams carried winter's melt down to thirsty lowlands. Spring comes fast in the high country, Bennett said, coming up beside her. One day it's winter, next day the whole mountain's alive again. They had fallen into an easy rhythm over the winter months. The threat of the rancher's claim still hung over them, but their daily work and growing companionship made it seem less immediate. Bennett's limp had improved with regular care and rest, while Leilani moved through the cabin with increasing confidence, her natural grace no longer hidden by shame. I found Father's old satchel while organizing the storage chest, Leilani said. I never looked through it properly before. Would you help me? Bennett nodded, understanding her hesitation. They settled at the rough-hewn table, where morning light streamed through the window. The leather satchel was worn and stained, its contents rattling as Leilani set it down. I always thought it just held his drinking money, she admitted, working the tarnished clasp. He guarded it so carefully when he was sober enough to remember it. The satchel's interior yielded surprising treasures. A daguerreotype of Leilani's mother, young and smiling. A small Bible with dates of births and deaths recorded in faded ink. A wooden toy horse, lovingly carved. Leilani touched each item gently, her eyes bright with memories. There's more, Bennett said, pointing to a packet of yellowed papers tied with string. Looks official. Leilani untied the bundle with trembling fingers. The papers crackled as she unfolded them, revealing elaborate letterhead and official seals. Bennett leaned closer, his expression changing as he read over her shoulder. These are railroad surveys, he said, voice tight with sudden excitement. And water rights deeds. Your family. He paused, scanning further. Leilani, your family owns the rights to Mountain Spring. Mountain Spring? She looked confused. The one up on Miller's Ridge? Bennett stood, pacing despite his limp. That spring is the reason Thaddeus Crawford, the rancher who's trying to claim you, bought all that land up there. It's the only reliable water source for 50 miles in summer. He's been trying to control it for years, forcing smaller ranchers to pay for access. He turned to her, eyes intense. But according to these papers, your grandfather sold the railroad a right-of-way through the valley but kept the water rights. They're yours by inheritance. Leilani stared at the documents, their legal language swimming before her eyes. But father never mentioned. He probably didn't understand what he had, Bennett said grimly. Crawford must have known, though. That's why he kept lending your father money, hoping he'd eventually claim the rights as payment. He sat back down, touching the papers reverently. This changes everything. Leilani, that spring could supply water for every herd in the county. In frontier terms, it's worth a fortune. The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of rushing water. Leilani's hands shook as she carefully refolded the deeds. All those years of mockery and shame, of feeling worthless and unwanted, and she had been carrying this legacy without knowing it. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would God let me suffer so long if he knew? Maybe, Bennett said softly. He was waiting for the right time, waiting until you were strong enough to handle it. He reached across the table, his scarred hand covering hers. You needed to know your own worth first, Leilani. Not from papers or property, but from who you are. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I was so angry with father. For drinking away our money. For selling me like cattle. But he kept these safe all those years. Your father was a broken man, Bennett said. But somewhere inside, he must have known these papers mattered. Known they belonged to you. They spent the afternoon examining every document, Bennett explaining terms Leilani didn't understand. The spring's location was carefully mapped, along with calculations of its flow rate and potential service area. Her grandfather's signature stood bold and clear on every page, along with official stamps from territorial offices. As evening approached, Leilani prepared their supper, moving through familiar tasks while her mind whirled with new possibilities. Bennett built up the fire, then sat watching her work, his expression thoughtful. Crawford won't give up easily, he said finally. When he learns about these deeds, he'll try something. We need to be ready. Leilani nodded, stirring the stew pot. I'm not afraid anymore, she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Not of him, not of what people think of me. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Bennett's gaze. God brought me here for a reason. Maybe it wasn't just about saving me from shame. Maybe it was about bringing water to people who need it. Bennett's weather-worn face softened. You've changed since that night at the pie. Auction block, grown stronger, sure of yourself. Because you saw me, she said simply. Not my size, not my father's sins, just me. She ducked her head, suddenly shy. You made me feel worth something before we ever found these papers. The lamp flames flickered as evening deepened outside. Through the window, the first stars pricked the darkening sky. Bennett stood, moving to the shelf where he kept his Bible. May I read something? He asked, opening to a marked page. When Leilani nodded, he began. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Leilani's breath caught. Jeremiah 29 verse 11, she whispered. Mother used to quote that. Your mother was right, Bennett said, closing the Bible gently. God had a plan, even when things seemed darkest. These deeds aren't what make you valuable, Leilani. They're just proof of what I already knew. You're a treasure this whole territory needs. The words hung in the lamplit air between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to voice. Leilani stirred the stew again, cheeks flushed. Supper's ready, she said softly. They ate in comfortable silence, each lost in thought. Outside, spring peepers had begun their evening chorus, their song mixing with the eternal voice of the streams. New life was stirring everywhere in the mountain meadows, in the warming earth, and in Leilani's heart. After the dishes were cleaned, they sat together near the fire. The deeds lay on the table, powerful in their simplicity. Leilani touched them one last time before carefully returning them to the satchel. What do we do now? She asked. Tomorrow, we ride to town, Bennett said. File these papers properly, make sure everything's legal and clear. Then we face whatever comes. He looked at her steadily. Together, Leilani nodded, feeling the rightness of it settle in her soul. Together, she echoed. The fire crackled, peacefully, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Through the window, moonlight silvered the new grass and early flowers. Somewhere up on Miller's Ridge, Mountain Spring flowed steady and true, as it had for generations, waiting to serve, just as Leilani had waited to discover her own strength and purpose. I never thought, she began, then paused, gathering her thoughts. That night at the auction, I thought my life was over. That shame would be all I'd ever know. She looked up at Bennett, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But God had other plans. He always does, Bennett said softly. Sometimes we just have to wait for them to be revealed. They sat together as the fire burned low, listening to the symphony of spring waters racing down the mountainside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, in this quiet cabin, Leilani felt the last chains of worthlessness fall away. She had found her place not just in Bennett's home, but in God's greater plan for the land and its people. The deeds were just paper. After all, the real treasure was the woman she had become, strong enough now to carry their weight and the responsibility they brought. As Bennett had said, she had always been valuable. These yellowed documents just helped her believe it at last. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Thaddeus Crawford's ranch house as his foreman burst through the door, waving a crumpled notice from the Territorial Land Office. "Boss!" The foreman's face was flushed with exertion. "That mountain man, Bennett Boone, he's filed water rights on Mountain Spring. Claims his woman inherited them from her grandfather." Crawford's coffee cup shattered against the wall. "What did you say?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Got the papers authenticated this morning. Marshal Dillard himself witnessed it." The foreman stepped back, watching his employer's face darken like a thunderhead. Crawford stood, his chair scraping across the floor. 20 years he'd spent buying up land around that spring, squeezing out smaller ranchers, building his empire drop by precious drop. Now some mountain savage and that worthless girl threatened everything. "Saddle my horse," he growled, "and send riders to gather the men. All of them." Within an hour, Crawford addressed 24 hard-faced cowboys in his yard. The spring wind whipped their coats as he paced before them. "That hermit Bennett Boone's trying to steal what's rightfully mine," he announced. "Claims he's got deeds from that fat girl's grandfather. But we all know what he is, a killer who served the army hunting Indians. You think a man like that comes by anything honest?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Crawford's voice rose. "He forged those papers, sure as sunrise. And I'm offering $500 to any man who helps me prove it." The cowboys straightened in their saddles. That was serious money, enough to buy good land or a string of horses. "Spread the word," Crawford ordered. "Let everyone know what kind of snake Bennett Boone really is. Then meet back here at sundown. We're going to settle this mountain man problem once and for all." As his men rode out, Crawford smiled coldly. He'd built his empire through fear and force. One more application of both would solve this challenge too. Meanwhile, Bennett and Leilani stood before Marshal Dillard's desk in town, watching him examine the water rights documents. The marshal's office smelled of wood smoke and gun oil, wanted posters curling on the walls in the spring dampness. "These are genuine," Dillard finally said, looking up from the yellowed papers. "Territorial seal, proper signatures, everything in order. The spring and water rights belong to Miss Leilani by inheritance." Bennett's shoulders relaxed slightly, but Leilani noticed the marshal's troubled expression. "There's something else, isn't there?" she asked quietly. Dillard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Paper law is one thing, but out here might often makes right. Crawford's got 24 riders who'll swear whatever he tells them to swear, and he's already spreading word that these documents are forged." "That's a lie." Leilani's voice shook with anger. "Course it is," Dillard agreed. "But lies travel fast when there's money behind them, and Crawford's got plenty of that." He carefully rolled the deeds, handing them back to Bennett. "I'll uphold the law best I can, but I've got just 2 deputies. You two watch yourselves. Crawford won't take this lying down." Bennett nodded grimly. "Much obliged for the warning, Marshal." He touched Leilani's elbow. "We should head back before dark." They left town as afternoon shadows lengthened across the muddy street. Spring snow was melting in the warming air, turning the trail treacherous. Their horses picked their way carefully through patches of ice and mud. An hour into their journey, Bennett reined in suddenly, head cocked. Leilani heard it too, the distant crack of a branch, the soft clink of tack that wasn't theirs. "Riders," Bennett whispered, following just out of sight. Leilani's heart hammered. "Crawford's men? Most likely." Bennett studied the trail ahead. "We can't outrun them on this ground, horses would break their legs in the mud. We'll have to make for home and hope we get there first." They urged their mounts to a faster pace, though every step risked a deadly slip. The spring twilight deepened around them as they climbed higher into the mountains. Somewhere behind, hidden by trees and gathering darkness, their pursuers kept pace. Leilani's thighs ached from gripping her saddle, and fear churned in her stomach. But she remembered her prayers, remembered God's faithfulness. He hadn't brought her this far to abandon her now. The cabin finally appeared through the trees, a dark shape against the purple dusk. They dismounted quickly, Bennett leading the horses into the lean-to stable while Leilani unlocked the cabin door with trembling fingers. Inside, Bennett immediately began barring the shutters. "Get the lamps lit," he ordered quietly. "Then help me check our supplies." Leilani moved through the familiar space, lighting the oil lamps that cast warm pools of light across the rough wooden floors. She gathered their remaining ammunition while Bennett inspected his Colt single-action revolver with practiced hands. "We have enough food and water to last a siege," she reported, trying to keep her voice steady. "And plenty of lamp oil." Bennett nodded, sliding cartridges into the revolver's chambers. "Good, though I expect Crawford will try something before morning. He won't want to give us time to send for help." A wolf howled in the distance, making Leilani jump. Or was it a signal? She couldn't tell anymore, every sound suddenly sinister in the gathering night. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. Bennett crossed to her, his scarred face gentle in the lamplight. "Being scared just means you're smart, but you're stronger than you know, Leilani. And we've got right on our side. And God," she added firmly. "Yes." Bennett checked the cabin's heavy door one more time. "And God." Leilani knelt beside their bed, clasping her hands. The familiar words of prayer steadied her racing heart. "Lord, make me strong enough," she whispered. "Not just for myself, but for Bennett, for the people who need this water. Help us stand firm in what's right." Bennett stood watch at the window, his revolver ready. Outside, night wrapped the mountain in darkness, broken only by a thin slice of moon. Somewhere in that darkness, violent men were gathering, driven by greed and lies. But here in the cabin's lamplight, Leilani felt her fear transforming into something else, determination perhaps. Or faith. The same faith that had sustained her through years of mockery and shame now gave her courage to face whatever came. She joined Bennett at the window, their shoulders touching, as they peered into the night. The spring wind whispered through pine branches, carrying the eternal song of mountain spring. That water had flowed since before any of them were born, and would flow long after. Their task was simply to ensure it flowed freely, for all who needed it. "They're coming," Bennett murmured, his keen eyes catching movement in the shadows. Leilani squared her shoulders, remembering the marshal's words about might and right. But she knew something Crawford and his men didn't. True strength came from a source deeper than violence, surer than gold. "Then let them come," she said quietly. "We'll face them together." Bennett's hand found hers in the darkness, rough palm against smooth, squeezing once. They stood together, watching and waiting, as the night drew its dark curtain across the mountain. The water rights deeds lay secure in Bennett's strongbox, their yellowed pages holding the power to change the territory's future. But the real strength in that cabin came from two hearts joined in purpose, standing firm against the gathering storm. Outside, horses' hooves crunched through spring snow. The time for waiting was nearly over. Dawn crept over the mountain with deceptive gentleness. Pink light touched the snow-patched ground, and birds called their morning songs. Leilani had dozed fitfully in a chair by the window, while Bennett kept watch through the night. No riders had shown themselves, though occasional sounds betrayed their presence in the surrounding woods. "Here comes the sun," Bennett murmured, his voice rough from the long vigil. He shifted his weight, checking his revolver one more time. "They'll likely move soon. Light's what they need for accuracy." Leilani nodded, her throat tight. She'd prayed through most of the night, fingering the small cross her mother had left her. The cabin felt both sanctuary and trap, its sturdy logs their only shield against Crawford's men. The first shot came without warning. Glass exploded, inward as a bullet shattered the window beside Bennett's head. He dropped instantly, dragging Leilani down with him. More shots followed, splintering the shutters and thudding into the cabin walls. "Stay down," Bennett shouted above the chaos. He crawled to the window, raised himself just enough to see, and fired back. His aim was true. A cry of pain echoed from the trees, followed by the sound of a body falling from a horse. "One down," Bennett growled, but there was no satisfaction in his voice, just grim certainty that more would come. Bullets continued to rain against the cabin. Leilani pressed herself against the floor, heart hammering as wood splinters flew around her. The air filled with gun smoke and the sharp smell of fear. Then Bennett made a terrible sound, half grunt, half gasp. Leilani looked up to see him stagger, his hand pressed to his side. Dark blood welled between his fingers. "Bennett!" She scrambled toward him as his knees buckled. He tried to wave her back. "Stay down, they'll—" But he couldn't finish. His legs gave way completely, and he slumped against the wall, leaving a dark smear as he slid down. Leilani didn't think. She couldn't. Training from months of hauling water and chopping wood took over. She grabbed Bennett under his arms and pulled with all her might, dragging him away from the window toward the relative safety of the cabin's center. Her muscles screamed with the effort. Bennett was a big man, solid with muscle even after his lean winter. But fear and desperate love lent her strength she didn't know she had. Inch by inch, she hauled him across the rough wooden floor while bullets continued to pepper the cabin walls. "Hold still," she ordered, her voice surprisingly steady as she examined his wound. The bullet had torn through his side, leaving an ugly furrow that bled freely. Not immediately fatal, but bad enough. She grabbed clean rags from her mending basket and pressed them hard against the wound, making Bennett hiss, in pain. "Sorry," she whispered, "but I have to stop the bleeding." "Behind you," Bennett gasped. "My belt. Use it to bind." She understood, quickly pulling his belt free and using it to secure the bandage tight against his side. Her hands were red with his blood, but she forced herself to focus on the task, not the fear trying to choke her. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. In the sudden quiet, she could hear men's voices, though not their words. The raiders were regrouping, probably planning their next move. "Water," Bennett whispered. His face had gone gray with pain and blood loss. Leilani grabbed their water bucket, helping him take small sips. His skin felt clammy under her touch, and his breathing was too fast, too shallow. "We may not," he started, then had to catch his breath. "May not survive another round. You should run. Back door, while they're regrouping. Maybe you can—" "No." Leilani's voice was firm. "I won't leave you. Leilani, please. They'll kill me anyway, but you—" I said no. She gripped his hand hard. "We face this together. Remember?" A voice boomed from outside, cutting off Bennett's reply. Crawford's voice, rough with anger. "You in there. One of my men's dead. That's murder charges on top of forgery, Boone." Leilani felt Bennett tense, trying to push himself upright. She held him down with gentle firmness. "And you, girl," Crawford continued. "Your pa's debts ain't settled. You're still mine by rights. Come out now. I'll show mercy. Stay in there. You'll watch your mountain man die slow before I drag you back to town." The threat hung in the morning air like gun smoke. Leilani looked down at Bennett, saw the fear in his eyes. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. The same fear she felt for him. "Even if you surrender," Bennett whispered urgently, "he won't keep his word. Men like that, I know." Leilani checked his bandage, adjusted it slightly. "I lived with a man like that for 18 years. Remember? I know exactly what mercy means to them." She rose carefully, staying low, and moved to check their ammunition. They had perhaps 20 rounds left for Bennett's revolver and the old shotgun with 6 shells. Not much, against however many riders remained out there. But they had something Crawford and his men didn't understand. Something worth more than bullets or threats or even gold. They had truth on their side. They had love. They had faith. "Lord," she whispered, echoing her prayer from the night before, "make me strong enough." Bennett's voice came weak but clear from behind her. "You already are." She turned back to him, saw the pride mixing with pain in his eyes. This man who had bought her like cattle but treated her like a queen, who had seen worth in her when everyone else saw only shame, who had given her not just shelter but purpose, not just safety but love. "We'll need to move you," she said, mind working quickly. "Get you behind that big chest, where they can't hit you if they rush the door. More shots interrupted her planning. These seemed aimed higher, at the roof, testing their defenses, maybe, or trying to drive them into the open. Wood splintered and cracked above them as bullets found their marks. Leilani crouched beside Bennett, shielding him with her body as debris rained down. His breathing had grown more labored, and fresh blood was seeping through the bandage. He needed a doctor, and soon. But first, they had to survive. Crawford's voice came again, closer this time. "Last chance. Send the girl out, Boone. Maybe we'll let you live." Leilani felt Bennett's hand close weakly around her wrist. "Don't," he whispered. "Rather die than see you." "Hush." She touched his face gently. "Save your strength. I'm not going anywhere." Outside, horses stamped and snorted. Men's voices murmured, planning their next move. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another beautiful spring day in the mountains. The kind of day that usually filled Leilani's heart with joy and gratitude. Today, it just showed their enemies where to aim. She checked Bennett's revolver, made sure it was fully loaded. The weight felt strange in her hand. She'd learned to shoot over the winter, but only at targets and game. Never at men. Never for survival. But as she looked down at Bennett's pale face, at the blood staining his shirt, she knew she would do whatever was necessary. Crawford and his men thought her weak, thought her worthless, thought they could bully and threaten her into submission, just like her father had all those years. They were wrong. She was Leilani Boone now, and she would not surrender. The raiders struck without warning. The cabin door burst inward with a thunderous crack, splinters flying as 3 men rushed through. Leilani's hands trembled on Bennett's revolver, but she remembered his patient lessons during winter target practice. Sight down the barrel, his voice echoed in her memory. Breathe out slow, then squeeze gentle-like. The first rider charged forward, pistol raised. Leilani's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him backward into his companions. The other 2 stumbled, cursing as they dragged their wounded friend behind an overturned table. "Got some fight in the fat girl," one shouted, followed by cruel laughter. Leilani ignored the taunt, focusing instead on the doorway. More shadows moved outside, at least 4 more men waiting to rush in. Behind her, Bennett's breathing had grown more labored, his skin clammy with fever. She had to do something, and quick. Another rider dove through the door, rolling toward the far wall. Leilani's second shot went wide, splintering wood where his head had been a moment before. He answered with a wild blast from his shotgun that peppered the ceiling with buckshot. "Save the ammunition," Bennett whispered hoarsely. "Make each shot count." She nodded, though her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear over its thunder. 4 shots left, in the revolver. 6 shells in the shotgun propped against the wall. Not nearly enough for a drawn-out fight. More gunfire erupted from outside, forcing her to duck lower. Through the chaos, she caught fragments of Crawford's orders. Circle round back, smoke them out. The back door. Of course they'd try to surround them. And with Bennett unable to move, a plan formed in Leilani's mind. Not a good plan, maybe, but the only one she could see. Her eyes fell on the hatchet hanging by the woodpile, the same one she'd used to split logs all winter long. "Cover me," she whispered to Bennett, pressing the revolver back into his trembling hands. "I'm going out back." "No." His fingers clutched weakly at her sleeve. "Too dangerous." "Trust me." She touched his face gently. "I'm stronger than they think." Before he could argue further, she crouched low and scrambled toward the back wall, grabbing the hatchet as she went. The worn wooden handle felt familiar in her grip, almost comforting. How many cords of wood had she split with it through the long winter months? Her arms remembered the weight, the swing, the satisfaction of clean strikes. A bullet whined past her head as she reached the back door. Bennett answered with careful shots from the revolver, making the raiders duck for cover. The distraction was all she needed. Leilani eased the door open just enough to slip through, then pressed herself flat against the outer wall. Cold morning air filled her lungs as she listened intently. Hoarse snorts from around the corner, boot scuffs in the mud. 1 man, maybe 2, creeping toward the back door. She gripped the hatchet tighter and waited. The first rider appeared slowly, rifle leading the way. He was young, barely more than a boy, with patchy whiskers and nervous eyes. He never saw Leilani until she was already moving. She struck like Bennett had taught her to swing the hatchet, from the hips, using her whole body's weight. The flat of the blade caught the boy's temple with a dull thunk. He dropped without a sound, rifle falling from limp fingers. Leilani caught him before he hit the ground, lowering his unconscious form quietly into the mud. Her hands shook as she checked his pulse. Still strong. Thank the Lord she hadn't had to kill him. His horse stood nearby, reins dragging. Leilani grabbed them, speaking soft and low to calm the nervous animal. She'd learned to ride over the winter too, though she'd never attempted anything like what she was planning now. She whispered, running her hand down the horse's sweaty neck. "We've got work to do." More gunfire erupted from the cabin's front, followed by shouts and curses. Bennett was keeping them busy, but she knew he couldn't last long in his condition. She had to hurry. The deeds, the water rights that had started all this, Crawford would have taken them back to his ranch, probably locked away in his study. If she could reach them, prove their claim once and for all. Leilani gathered the reins and mounted as quietly as she could, grimacing as the saddle creaked under her weight. The horse shifted nervously but held steady. She offered up a silent prayer of thanks for all those hours Bennett had spent teaching her to ride properly, not side saddle like a proper lady. "Use me as I am, Lord," she whispered aloud, her voice trembling but determined, "not as I wish I was." Then she dug her heels in and burst from behind the cabin at a gallop. Shouts of surprise erupted behind her. A few scattered shots kicked up dirt around the horse's hooves, but she was already moving too fast for careful aim. She hunched low over the horse's neck, using her bulk to stay centered in the saddle as they thundered down the mountain trail. Wind whipped tears from her eyes as they rode. The horse seemed to sense her urgency, stretching out into a ground-eating gallop that ate up the miles. Leilani's thighs burned from gripping the saddle, and her hands ached from holding the reins. But she didn't dare slow down. She knew Crawford's ranch lay about 5 miles south. She and Bennett had passed it on their trips to town. With luck, most of his men would be up here at the cabin, leaving the main house lightly guarded. Without luck, she'd likely die trying. But better that than watching Bennett bleed out while Crawford's men tortured them both. The morning sun climbed higher as she rode, warming her face and drying the sweat and dust that streaked her cheeks. Her heart still raced, but now with exhilaration as much as fear. For the first time in her life, she was taking bold action, not just enduring what others did to her. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, their new spring leaves shivering in the morning breeze. Leilani guided the horse carefully around the worst patches of mud and snow, but kept up as much speed as she dared. Every minute counted now. She topped a rise and saw Crawford's ranch spread out below. A big white house surrounded by barns and corrals, a creek winding through green pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see a few horses in the yard. No riders in sight yet, but they'd be coming soon. Leilani patted her horse's sweaty neck. "Just a little further, friend. Then we'll see this through together." She touched the hatchet at her belt, felt its solid weight. Not much of a weapon against guns, maybe. But she had surprise on her side. And righteousness. And most importantly, she had nothing left to lose. "Hold on, Bennett," she whispered, gathering the reins for the final push. "I'm coming back for you. I promise." Then she drove her heels in once more, and horse and rider thundered down toward Crawford's ranch, raising a cloud of dust that blazed golden in the morning sunday. Leilani crept into Crawford's barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smell of hay and horse sweat filled her nose as she burrowed deep into a stack near the back wall. Through gaps in the wooden slats, she watched riders thunder into the yard, their horses lathered and blowing hard. "Get fresh mounts," one called. "Crawford wants that cabin burned to the ground before sundown. That mountain man's done for anyway, bleeding out by now." Leilani pressed her fist against her mouth, stifling a gasp. Bennett, dying alone while she hid here in the hay. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Once the men dispersed, she slipped from the barn and darted to the ranch house's back door. The kitchen stood empty, sunlight streaming across worn floorboards. Down the hall, voices drifted from what must be Crawford's office. "File these contracts," a sharp voice ordered, "and bring me those water deed papers." Want to make sure they're locked up tight. Leilani's pulse quickened. The clerk. It had to be. Taking a deep breath, she strode down the hall and burst through the office door. The clerk jerked up from his desk, spectacles sliding down his nose. Who in blazes? The deeds, Leilani demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Give them to me now, he sneered, reaching for a drawer. Get out of here, you fat. Before he could finish, Leilani seized him by his shirt front. With strength born of months splitting wood and hauling water, she lifted him clean off his feet and threw him against the wall. His eyes went wide with shock as he slumped to the floor. Leilani yanked open desk drawers until she found the familiar yellowed papers. Clutching them to her chest, she ran. Shouts erupted behind her as she mounted her waiting horse. 2 riders burst from the stable, spurring their mounts in pursuit. Leilani drove her heels into her horse's flanks, riding hard for the mountain trail. Hooves thundered close behind. A hand grabbed for her reins. She swerved, nearly losing her seat. The second rider came alongside, reaching for her arm. Without thinking, Leilani grabbed a loose fence post as they passed the corral. She swung with all her might, catching him square in the chest. He toppled from his saddle with a cry of pain. The deeds clutched tight in one hand, reins in the other. Leilani rode like she never had before, her horse's stride eating up the distance toward home, toward Bennett. The mountain trail opened before Leilani as she crested the final ridge. Her heart seized at the sight below. A dozen riders circled Bennett's cabin like wolves around wounded prey. 2 men approached the walls with oil-soaked torches, while others trained rifles on the door. Stop! Leilani's voice rang out across the clearing. She urged her lathered horse forward, holding the precious papers high above her head. These deeds prove the truth. At that moment, more horses thundered up the trail behind her. Marshal Dillard led a group of townsfolk, their arrival throwing the ranch hands into confusion. The torchbearers hesitated, lowering their flames. The spring belongs to my family, Leilani declared, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. These documents show the legal claim, filed 20 years ago. The rancher knew. That's why he wanted me gone. The marshal dismounted, taking the deeds from her trembling hands. He studied them carefully while the crowd waited in tense silence. Behind him, more townspeople arrived, including the preacher and store owner. These papers are genuine, Marshal Dillard announced. County seal and all. The water rights belong to the Boone family now, through legal purchase of Miss Leilani. The cabin door creaked open. Bennett stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to his bandaged side, the other gripping his rifle. Though pale from blood loss, he straightened tall. She speaks true, he said, his deep voice carrying authority despite his weakness. Crawford tried to steal what was rightfully hers. The rancher burst forward on his horse, face purple with rage. You're all fools. That worthless girl can't. That's enough. Marshal Dillard's voice cracked like a whip. He nodded to his deputies. Arrest him for attempted murder and theft. Add assault and fraud to the charges. As the deputies moved in, the watching crowd began to cheer. The same townspeople who had jeered at Leilani months ago now called out praise for her bravery. The store owner's wife pushed forward to squeeze her hand, while others gathered close to hear the full story. Leilani sat tall in her saddle, feeling the warmth of Bennett's proud gaze. For the first time in her life, no one mentioned her size or shape. They saw only her courage, her strength, her dignity restored at last. The marshal's horse plodded steadily ahead as they made their way back to the cabin. Spring sunshine warmed the mountain air, but Bennett slumped in his saddle, his face drawn with pain. Leilani rode close beside him, ready to catch him if he swayed. I'll have my deputies patrol regular like, Marshal Dillard said, patting the deed papers in his coat. These'll be locked up safe in the town vault. Nobody'll trouble you folks now. Inside the cabin, Bennett barely made it to the bed before collapsing. His wound had reopened during the standoff, leaving his bandages crimson. Leilani worked through the night, cleaning the injury and brewing willow bark tea for his fever. She prayed over him as she changed the dressings, her strong hands gentle against his skin. Days melted together as Bennett fought to heal. Leilani kept vigil, cooking broths, reading psalms aloud, and tending the cabin's needs. The dogs whined at the door until she let them in to lay their heads on Bennett's bed, their presence a comfort to them both. When Bennett's fever finally broke, color returned to his face. He watched Leilani move about the cabin, her quiet strength filling their home with peace. She had changed, not in size or shape, but in how she carried herself. Pride had replaced shame in her bearing. One evening, as sunset painted the cabin walls gold, Bennett reached for her hands as she brought his supper. His fingers were warm and sure against hers. "The Lord made you strong, Leilani," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "And I was blind until I saw it. Your body is stunning because it holds the bravest heart I've ever known." Tears spilled down Leilani's cheeks, but these were different from the bitter tears she'd shed in shame. Bennett tugged gently at her hands, and together they knelt beside the bed. "Thank you, Lord," Bennett prayed, his voice strong despite his weakness, "for showing me true beauty through your eyes. Thank you for giving me a partner whose courage matches her kindness." Leilani's tears fell freely as they prayed together, thanking God for mercy, for courage, and for love that saw past surface to soul. In that moment, she felt truly beautiful, truly strong, truly loved. Exactly as she was. Spring painted the mountains in vibrant hues, tender shoots pushed through dark soil, and rushing rivers sang with newfound strength. Inside the snug cabin, fresh herbs dried from rafters while savory stews bubbled on the cookstove. Bennett, his wound fully healed, stood in the yard teaching Leilani to handle the sled dogs. Her confident voice rang out commands as the team responded eagerly. Near the cabin's south wall, her kitchen garden sprouted promising rows of vegetables. On Sundays, they rode into town for services. The preacher's warm welcome and the congregation's respectful nods replaced former sneers. Leilani walked proudly beside Bennett, their fingers intertwined. That evening, firelight danced across the cabin's walls as they sat close together. Leilani's whisper filled the peaceful silence. "We're not alone anymore." Bennett squeezed her hand. "Found family's the best kind." The lamp's gentle glow illuminated their joined hands, blessing the new life they'd built on dignity, love, and unwavering faith. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.